December 19, 1944, Camp Ruston, Louisiana. The morphine had not yet dulled the fire in Oberleutnant Klaus Becker's left leg. Through the haze of pain and fever, he heard voices speaking in English, the language of the enemy, and felt hands, surprisingly gentle, lifting him from the stretcher. His last coherent thought before consciousness slipped away was one of bitter certainty. They would leave him to die. Perhaps in some cold storage room, perhaps simply on the ground outside the medical building, whose whitewashed walls he glimpsed through half-closed eyes. That was what happened to prisoners. Everyone knew this. The propaganda ministry had told them. His own officers had warned him. And somewhere, in the darkest corners of his own experience, he had seen what became of Russian prisoners in Wehrmacht hands. He was 23 years old. He had been a prisoner of the Americans for exactly 7 hours. What Klaus Becker could not know, what thousands of German soldiers arriving at American prisoner of war camps between 1943 and 1945 could not know, was that they were about to encounter something far more disturbing than cruelty. They were about to encounter competence, abundance, and a systematic application of medical care that would shatter every belief they held about their captors, about their own nation, and about the war itself. The statistics told one story. Between May 1943 and May 1945, approximately 378,000 German prisoners of war arrived on American soil. They came across the Atlantic in converted Liberty ships, packed into holds that still smelled of the cargo they had carried eastward: tanks, ammunition, food for the Allied armies. The journey took between 10 and 14 days. Many arrived sick. Nearly all arrived malnourished. The Wehrmacht had not been generous with rations even to its own soldiers in those final years of the war. It had certainly not wasted resources on captured prisoners awaiting transport. Pneumonia ravaged the holds of the transport ships. Diphtheria spread in the close quarters. Men who had survived months in the frozen hell of the Eastern Front or the Italian mountains now shivered with fevers in the darkness below deck, listening to the throb of the ship's engines and wondering if they would see land again. Some did not. The death rate during transport hovered around 3%. Not catastrophic by wartime standards, but significant enough that every transport ship carried body bags alongside medical supplies. Those who survived the crossing arrived in ports along the East Coast: New York, Boston, Norfolk. They were processed with an efficiency that was, to many of them, the first shock. Names recorded, nationalities confirmed, identification photographs taken, then medical triage, immediate, systematic, and thorough. This was where the second shock occurred. In the Wehrmacht Medical Corps, triage meant sorting the salvageable from the doomed. Resources were limited. Time was precious. Men with serious wounds might wait hours or days for surgery, and if they died in the interim, well, that simply meant the limited supply of morphine and surgical thread could be used on someone with better chances. Klaus Becker had seen this system in operation at field hospitals in France and later in the Ardennes. He had learned to accept it as the natural order of wartime medicine. The American system operated on different principles. When Klaus Becker next opened his eyes, how much later he could not tell, he found himself in a bed with clean white sheets. Not a cot, not a stretcher on the ground. A bed. The ceiling above him was smooth painted plaster. Electric lights hummed softly. The air smelled of disinfectant and something else he could not immediately identify. Fresh paint. His left leg felt distant, wrapped in what seemed to be an enormous amount of bandaging. A tube ran from his arm to a bottle hanging beside the bed. Through the fog of medication, he registered these details with the slow, methodical attention of a trained officer cataloging intelligence. Then he heard German voices. "He's waking up. Klaus, can you hear me?" Becker turned his head. The man standing beside his bed wore a white coat over what appeared to be a prisoner of war uniform, the standard blue-gray fatigues with PW stenciled on the back. But the hands emerging from the white coat sleeves were clean. The stethoscope around the man's neck looked new, and his face, though tired, showed none of the haggard desperation Becker had expected to see on a fellow prisoner. "I'm Dr. Friedrich Weber," the man said in German. "I was captured in North Africa in '43. I'm the chief medical officer for German prisoners at this facility." He paused, seeming to register Becker's confusion. "You're in the prisoner of war camp hospital at Camp Ruston, Louisiana. You've been here for 8 hours. The American surgeons operated on your leg immediately after you arrived. The shrapnel has been removed. The infection was extensive, but they believe you'll keep the leg." Becker's mouth felt full of cotton. "Operated? Immediately?" "Within 45 minutes of your arrival, yes." Weber pulled up a chair, an actual chair, wooden and solid, and sat down. "The Americans don't believe in waiting lists for surgical cases. Not for their own men, and apparently not for us either." The word "us" hung in the air between them. Becker looked at Weber's well-fed face, at the clean white coat, at the casual way he sat beside a patient's bed as if he had all the time in the world. None of this matched the reality Becker had been prepared for. "How many?" Becker's voice came out as a croak. "How many what? How many of us are treated? Do they choose?" Weber understood the question. "All of us," he said simply. "Every prisoner who arrives in serious condition is evaluated immediately. Those who need surgery receive it. Those who need medication receive it. I've been working in this hospital for 18 months now. I've seen hundreds of cases. I haven't yet seen them turn anyone away." Becker closed his eyes. The morphine was pulling him back down into darkness, but before consciousness faded again, one thought crystallized in his mind. This cannot be true. There must be a reason. They must want something. The wound had happened 3 days before his capture, during the American counteroffensive in the Ardennes that would later be called the Battle of the Bulge. Becker's company had been holding a position near a village whose name he never learned, one of 100 frozen, half-destroyed Belgian villages that all looked identical under their blankets of snow and ash. The Americans had come with tanks, with artillery, with an overwhelming weight of materiel that made the German defensive positions seem as substantial as paper. The shrapnel from an American shell had caught him as he ran between positions, trying to coordinate what remained of his platoon. He remembered the impact, less pain than a sense of profound wrongness, as if his leg had suddenly become a foreign object attached to his body. He remembered being dragged into a cellar by 2 of his men. He remembered the company medic, a boy of 19 whose hands shook as he tried to bandage the wound with strips torn from a dead man's uniform. Then the morphine, their last morphine, and the gray blur of retreat, of surrender, of American soldiers appearing in the cellar entrance with weapons raised, their breath steaming in the frozen air. He had expected to be shot. When that didn't happen, he expected to be left to die. When the Americans instead carried him to a jeep, wrapped him in blankets that seemed impossibly clean and warm, and drove him to a field station where a medic, American, young, competent, injected him with what must have been antibiotics and changed his dressing with practiced efficiency, he stopped expecting anything at all. His framework for understanding the world had failed him. The journey to the coast, then across the Atlantic, then by train, across what seemed like an entire continent to Louisiana, passed in a fever dream. He remembered kindness, which confused him. He remembered being fed soup by a Red Cross nurse on the transport ship, remembered her smiling at him despite not speaking a word of German. He remembered an American military doctor on the train checking his wound, shaking his head, making notes on a clipboard, and saying something to an orderly in English that made the orderly run ahead to the next station. They were preparing for his arrival. They were making sure he would receive immediate care. This realization came to him slowly, unwillingly, like a man discovering he has been wrong about something fundamental. The hospital at Camp Ruston held 90 beds. 63 were occupied when Becker arrived. The patients represented a cross-section of German military medicine's failures. Men with frostbite contracted during the Russian winter of 1942 and never properly treated. Men with respiratory diseases that had festered for months in field hospitals lacking proper medications. men with wounds that had become infected, reinfected, and chronically infected because surgical intervention came too late, or not at all. Dr. Weber had been captured at Tunis in May 1943, part of the final collapse of the Afrika Korps. He had been a surgeon in Berlin before the war, had been drafted into the Wehrmacht Medical Service in 1939, and had spent 4 years watching men die of conditions that should have been survivable. When the Americans offered him the position of chief medical officer for German prisoners at Camp Ruston, his first instinct had been suspicion. His second instinct, after he saw the facility, was a kind of professional fury at the contrast between what he now had access to and what he had lacked in 4 years of Wehrmacht service. "They gave me a budget," Weber told Becker during one of the lieutenant's first fully conscious afternoons. "An actual budget for medical supplies, morphine, sulfa drugs, surgical equipment, bandages. I submit requests, and they arrive, sometimes within days." Do you understand what that means? Becker, still weak but increasingly alert, understood. In the Wehrmacht, medical supplies moved according to the logic of strategic priority. Frontline units received what they needed when they needed it. Rear echelon hospitals made do. Prisoner of war facilities received nothing. The American Medical Corps operates on different principles, Weber continued. He seemed to need to explain this, to process it aloud. They have abundance, genuine abundance. The factories in America have been running at full capacity for years, producing everything from bandages to penicillin. And their distribution system. He paused, shaking his head. You could place an order for a specialized surgical instrument in Louisiana on Monday and have it arrive from a depot in Pennsylvania by Friday. I've done it, multiple times. It still astonishes me. The hospital had been built specifically for the prisoner of war camp, constructed in the summer of 1943 when the camp was established. It was not repurposed warehouse space or converted barracks. It was a purpose-built medical facility with operating rooms, recovery wards, an X-ray machine, a pharmacy, and a staff that included both American military doctors and German prisoner doctors like Weber. The American doctors supervised. The German doctors operated, examined, prescribed, and managed day-to-day care. It was a pragmatic arrangement born of linguistic necessity. Most American doctors spoke no German, and many German prisoners spoke no English, but it created an unusual dynamic. Weber found himself with more professional autonomy, more resources, and better working conditions than he had experienced at any point in his Wehrmacht career. He found this both liberating and profoundly disturbing. Becker's recovery followed a predictable course. The fever broke after 4 days. The wound began to heal cleanly. The antibiotics had prevented further infection, and the surgical debridement had been thorough. By the end of the 2nd week, he was able to walk with crutches. By the end of the 3rd week, he was walking unaided, though with a pronounced limp that Weber assured him would gradually improve. Physical recovery was one thing, psychological adjustment was another. The camp itself sprawled across 500 acres of Louisiana pine forest. It held approximately 4,000 German prisoners at any given time, with numbers fluctuating as men arrived from the front and were redistributed to smaller work camps throughout the region. The prisoners worked. This was in accordance with the Geneva Convention, but they worked at agricultural labor, forestry, and light manufacturing. 8 hours a day, 6 days a week. They were paid 80 cents per day in camp scrip, which they could use at the camp canteen. The canteen sold cigarettes, toiletries, writing paper, books. It sold chocolate. It sold coffee. Becker walked into the canteen for the first time 3 weeks after his arrival and stood in the doorway, staring at the shelves. A prisoner nearby, a Feldwebel from Bavaria who had been at the camp for 8 months, noticed his expression and laughed. I know, the Feldwebel said. We all look like that the first time. Wait until you try the American cigarettes. They're better than anything we had even before the war. How is this possible? Becker asked. The Feldwebel shrugged. America was never bombed. Their factories kept running. Their farms kept producing. Their cities were never burned. They have everything and they share it, even with us. I don't understand it either, but I've stopped questioning it. That night, Becker lay in his bunk, a proper bunk with a mattress and blanket, and tried to reconcile what he was experiencing with what he had been told. The propaganda had been clear. America was weak, decadent, controlled by Jewish financiers who exploited ordinary Americans while living in luxury themselves. American soldiers were soft, poorly trained, likely to collapse under serious pressure. American society was fragmenting under the weight of racial conflict and economic inequality. None of this matched what he saw. The American guards were professional, often friendly, and seemed genuinely uninterested in revenge or cruelty. The American medical care was not just adequate, but excellent, better than what he had received in Wehrmacht hospitals. The American abundance was not a trick or a temporary show, it was systemic, built into the fundamental structure of their supply chains and logistical planning. He had been taught that Germany was strong and America was weak. The evidence before him suggested the opposite. This inversion was not a small adjustment to his worldview. It was a total collapse of the framework through which he had understood the war, his role in it, and his nation's prospects. By February 1945, Becker had been transferred to a smaller work camp outside Shreveport. He worked in a logging operation, cutting timber for the American war effort, the irony of which was not lost on him. The work was hard, but not brutal. The food was adequate, not abundant like in the main camp, but sufficient. The supervision was loose. American guards, who seemed mainly interested in preventing escapes, though few prisoners attempted to escape. Where would they go? It was here that Becker met Hauptmann Ernst Richter, a former officer of the Wehrmacht's intelligence service who had been captured in France during the Normandy invasion. Richter had been in American captivity for 8 months. He had spent that time talking to other prisoners, reading American newspapers when he could get them, and trying to piece together an understanding of what was actually happening in the war. They sat together during lunch break one day in March, eating sandwiches made with white bread in the 6th year of the war, and Richter shared what he had learned. "The war is over," Richter said flatly. "Not officially, not yet, but in every meaningful sense. Germany cannot win. Germany cannot even fight much longer. The Americans are across the Rhine. The Russians are in East Prussia. The bombing has destroyed our industrial capacity. We have no oil, no steel production to speak of, no way to replace lost equipment. The Americans, meanwhile," he gestured at the sandwich in his hand, "the Americans have white bread for prisoners. Do you understand what that means?" Becker understood. White bread required wheat, milling facilities, functioning distribution networks, and enough abundance that you could afford to give it to enemy prisoners. Germany had none of these things. Germany's civilians were starving. Germany's soldiers were fighting with whatever ammunition remained from previous production runs. Germany was eating itself alive, trying to continue a war it could not win. "Why do they treat us well?" Becker asked. "They could treat us like we treated the Russians. Like we treated—" He stopped. There were things you did not say aloud, even to fellow prisoners. Richter looked at him for a long moment. "That's the question, isn't it? I've thought about this extensively. I think there are several reasons. First, practical. They're following the Geneva Convention because they want us to treat their prisoners according to the same rules. Second, logistical. They have so much abundance that treating us well costs them almost nothing. Third, and I think this is the most important," he paused, "they actually believe what they say. About human dignity, about the rules of war, about civilized behavior. It's not propaganda. It's how they actually operate. This was the most disturbing possibility of all. The letters began arriving in April. The camp had a postal system, censored, of course, but functional. Becker wrote to his mother in Hamburg, not knowing if she was still alive, not knowing if Hamburg still existed in any recognizable form. He wrote carefully, knowing the censors would read everything, but tried to convey some sense of his situation. 3 weeks later, a response arrived. His mother was alive, living in the cellar of their bombed house, surviving on rations that amounted to approximately 1,200 calories per day. His younger brother had been killed on the Eastern Front in January. Their neighborhood had been destroyed by RAF bombing the previous summer. She was glad he was safe. She did not understand how he could be safe as a prisoner in America, but she was glad. Becker read the letter 3 times, then put it away and did not take it out again for several days. The guilt was overwhelming. He was eating 2,500 calories a day. He slept in a bed with clean sheets. He received medical care. He worked 8-hour days and had Sundays off. Meanwhile, his mother lived in ruins and ate less than starvation rations, and his brother was dead. What did that make him? What did that say about the nation he had fought for? Other prisoners struggled with similar questions. The camp population was diverse: career officers and draftees, true believers and cynics, men who had fought on the Eastern Front and men who had served in quiet garrison positions in France. They argued, sometimes violently, about what was happening and what it meant. The true believers maintained that Germany was still strong, that new weapons were being prepared, that the Führer had a plan that would turn the tide. They pointed to the V-2 rockets, to jet aircraft, to rumors of atomic research. They maintained that the American treatment of prisoners was a sign of weakness, of decadent sentimentality that would ultimately lead to American defeat. The realists, and their numbers grew throughout the spring of 1945, saw things differently. They had access to American newspapers, filtered through camp authorities, but still more informative than anything they had received in Germany. They could read about the Allied advance into Germany, about cities falling, about the Wehrmacht's collapse. They knew how the war was ending. What they struggled with was what came after. May 8, 1945, the day Germany surrendered. The camp authorities announced it over the loudspeaker system in the morning. There would be no work that day. Prisoners were to remain in their barracks until further notice. The American guards were increased and carried rifles with fixed bayonets, a precaution against possible unrest. There was no unrest. There was stunned silence, then small groups of men gathering to talk in low voices, then an eerie quiet that settled over the entire camp like fog. Becker sat on his bunk and stared at the wall. 6 years of war. Over. Germany defeated. Everything he had fought for meaningless. The men who had died, his friends, his comrades, his brother, dead for a lost cause. The cities destroyed for nothing. The whole vast architecture of sacrifice and suffering, and at the end of it, nothing but defeat and ruins. That evening, Dr. Weber sought him out. They walked together along the fence line, inside the wire but away from the other prisoners. "What will you do?" Weber asked. "When they send us back?" "I don't know," Becker said. "Return to Hamburg, I suppose, if there's anything left to return to." Weber was silent for a while. Then, "I don't want to go back." Becker stopped walking. "What?" "I don't want to return to Germany." Weber's voice was steady, but there was something beneath it. Not shame exactly, but a deep weariness. "I've spent 20 months in American captivity. 20 months watching how their medical system works, how their administration functions, how they treat even their enemies. And I think about going back to Germany, to the ruins, to the hunger, to whatever chaos is going to follow. And I cannot make myself want it. They won't let you stay," Becker said. "I know, but there will be opportunities eventually. Immigration, perhaps, once things stabilize. I'm a trained surgeon. I have skills. And He stopped, searching for words. "I've seen the alternative now. I've seen how a functioning society operates. I can't unsee it." They resumed walking. Becker thought about his mother in the rubble of Hamburg, about the duty he owed to his family and nation, about the life he had known before the war. Then he thought about the hospital where they had saved his leg, about the white bread and the coffee and the systematic abundance, about the American doctor who had operated on him within an hour of his arrival and then checked on his progress daily for 2 weeks, despite having no obligation to do so. "I understand," he said finally. And he did. That was the terrible thing. He understood completely. The repatriation process began in the summer of 1945 and continued through 1946. Prisoners were returned to Europe in groups, processed through camps in France and England, then sent back to occupied Germany, to the American zone, the British zone, the French zone, or, worst of all, the Soviet zone. Many prisoners delayed their return as long as possible. They volunteered for extended work details. They claimed health issues. Some openly stated they were afraid of what they would find in Germany, or afraid of Soviet capture if they were sent to the wrong zone. The American authorities were generally sympathetic but firm. The war was over. Prisoners must return home. Becker returned to Hamburg in October 1946. The city he found bore little resemblance to the city he had left. Entire neighborhoods had been erased. The port was a graveyard of sunken ships. His family's house was a burned shell. His mother lived in a displaced persons camp on the outskirts of the city, surviving on Allied relief supplies and occasional work in a British Army laundry facility. She embraced him and wept, and told him she had prayed for his return every day. Then she asked about America, about the camp, about what it had been like. He tried to explain, but found himself editing the truth, softening it, because the full truth seemed like a betrayal. How could he tell her that he had lived better as a prisoner in America than she had lived as a civilian in her own country? How could he describe the hospital, the food, the systematic care, when she was living on bread and turnips? He stayed in Hamburg for 6 months. He helped his mother establish a small apartment in a partially reconstructed building. He found work as a laborer, clearing rubble and salvaging materials for reconstruction. He married a woman he had known before the war, whose husband had died in Russia. They had a child, a daughter, in 1948. And through all of this, he thought about America. In 1952, Becker emigrated. The paperwork took 14 months. The process involved interviews, background checks, medical examinations, and documentation of his military service. But the United States was accepting German immigrants, especially those with skills and clean political records. Becker had skills. He had learned English in the prisoner of war camp, had worked as a translator during his last months in captivity, had demonstrated administrative competence. He brought his wife and daughter. He left behind his mother, who refused to leave Germany despite having lost everything to it. He found work in Chicago, first as a factory worker, then as a supervisor, eventually as a manager. He learned American business practices, American efficiency, American abundance from the inside. He never forgot the camp in Louisiana. He never forgot Dr. Weber, who had emigrated to Canada in 1949 and eventually established a surgical practice in Toronto. He never forgot the shock of the hospital, of the immediate surgery, of the care that had seemed impossible but was, in fact, simply American. In 1963, he became an American citizen. At the naturalization ceremony, the judge asked the standard question, why did he want to become an American? Becker considered lying, considered offering the expected platitudes about freedom and opportunity. Instead, he told the truth. I was a German soldier, he said. I was wounded and captured in Belgium in December 1944. The Americans saved my life. They operated on me immediately, gave me antibiotics, treated me as a human being despite being their enemy. They showed me what a civilized society actually looks like. I've spent 19 years trying to become worthy of what they gave me in that hospital. That's why I want to be an American. The judge looked at him for a long moment, then nodded and signed the papers. Epilogue. The numbers told part of the story: 378,000 German prisoners held in American camps, with a mortality rate of less than 1%. By contrast, German and Japanese prisoner of war camps held Allied prisoners at mortality rates ranging from 27 to 40%. The disparity was not accidental. It reflected fundamental differences in resources, philosophy, and the systematic application of humanitarian principles even under the pressures of total war. But numbers never tell the whole story. The whole story lived in the memory of men like Klaus Becker, who carried with them for the rest of their lives the shock of unexpected mercy. It lived in the letters they wrote home, in the decisions they made about where to build their post-war lives, in the stories they told their children about what they had discovered in captivity. Some of them, like Becker, never returned to Germany. Some returned but carried America with them and their expectations of how society should function. All of them, even those who remained bitter about their defeat, had been changed by the experience of encountering a system that treated human beings as worthy of care, regardless of their nationality or status. This was perhaps the most subversive victory the Americans achieved, not the military defeat of Germany on the battlefield, but the quiet transformation of enemy soldiers into witnesses to a different way of organizing human society. Every German prisoner who experienced American abundance, American medical care, American systematic efficiency became a living refutation of the propaganda that had told them America was weak and decadent. The war ended in 1945. But for men like Becker, the real transformation began in a Louisiana hospital on a December day, when a surgeon operated on his mangled leg, not because he was an ally or a friend, but simply because he was a human being in need of care. That moment, that unexpected mercy, proved more powerful than any weapon, more lasting than any conquest. In the end, it changed everything,